I want to welcome to the show Dr. Alison Cook. Welcome.
Hello, thanks so much for having me.
I am so excited. I'm always excited to tell you the truth. I love talking with people, but your book, it's the best of you. I feel like really has a pulse and a heartbeat to what we're struggling with in terms of confidence, trusting ourselves, and a lot of misnomers of the Christian faith. And so I am so excited to talk with you and unpack some things that we think that we know, but do we know it? And what does that really look like? So I am excited.
Thank you so much. I'm so happy to be here.
Well, talk to us about the heart behind your book, The Best of You.
Yeah, it grew really out of both my own journey and out of my practice as a therapist, which, definitely we have our own parallel journeys, right, as we journey with our clients. So my own experience was I loved Jesus, I loved God, had a really profound experience of faith in college. But I had no clue who I was. I had no clue about myself. And I didn't even think that was important, right?
Right.
I really took quite literally this idea that I should love God and focus on other people. And so that weighed along with some of my childhood wounds and some of my own, the ways that sort of church messages got hooked in my soul led me to about a decade of just completely bypassing my own self, which led to burnout. I was in my early 30s and just essentially had to take a couple of years out of grad school to heal myself. And all of a sudden it was like, wait a minute, that's there are three people in this relationship. There's the loving God, loving others as yourself. And I had completely missed that whole piece. And so I became very interested in this idea of what is selfhood? What does it mean to become a whole self? And how does that happen in relationship with the God who made us? And then
So,
I just saw in my practice so many women struggling in that same way.
yeah. So, what does it mean to be the best of you? Because I think that can feel very selfish that we're trying to elevate ourselves or that we have to be perfect or like we're
Yeah.
filtered and, modified in some way. But I know that's not the heart behind what you're saying.
Yeah, it's very true in the book. The best of you is not perfection. The best of you is not some persona in any way, shape, or form. I really think the best of you is movement toward the person God wants us to become. It's really a process, right? It's a moving toward, it's moving away from the worst of who we can become, which honestly can be a day-to-day decision. It can be a step by step. It's every single day. Sometimes will say to people, we have choices to move toward the worst of who we are or toward the best of who we are. And that's a process of learning about what we're good at, what our gifts are, what our talents are, what our blind spots are, what our
Mhm.
wounds are. Really, the best of you is eventually, I think, who we will become, at the end of our lives, hopefully. It's not, we're never going to arrive there. Spoiler alert, I get into that in the last chapter. We don't really arrive at it. It's a process, but it's a movement toward this beautiful soul that God made uniquely in each of us.
Well, I love how you delineate between selfishness and selfhood.
Yeah.
Selfhood, it really draws us to connect with other people as well as connecting with ourselves. Talk to us a little bit about that because I feel like as we think about who am I as a person and really celebrating the gifts that God has given me, it can
Mhm.
feel very selfish or very arrogant to have this false confidence. And so I think for a lot of us, we don't really know how to hold that tension.
Yes, and I will say I had a lot of fear and trembling prayerfully writing this book, right? To thread the needle, because there's so much in our culture right now around this idea of true self just being you do you. Forget about other people. Forget about it's just the self is sort of the pinnacle, and that is not at all what I'm trying to talk about in this book, but selfhood. But at the same time, I think there's another extreme and I call that selflessness. And
Yes.
it's right. It's there's this selfishness, which is it's all about me, my way or the highway, and then and that's problematic. There's this other extreme that I see in faith communities, which is this selflessness, which is it's never about me. My needs don't matter. I should never have a say, and that's not healthy either. There's this middle ground, what I call selfhood, which psychologists call it selfhood, where it's about both. It's when I bring myself, the best of who I am in any given moment, into my relationships, and you bring yourself into relationship with me, I do believe that is how we begin to have healthy
Mhm.
relationships, right? It's two people coming together as two whole selves and creating something beautiful together. So selfhood is that middle. It's my needs matter and your needs matter. And guess what that means? We're going to have to work together to figure out how to honor both. And
Mhm.
that's just such a nuanced way, but I think it is the way that we see in scripture. I think it is what God wants for us. It's neither of those other extremes.
I completely agree with you. Like several years ago, I set out to read the Gospels from a perspective of boundaries and like how did
Mm,
Jesus create boundaries? Is boundaries really, is that a worldly thing? Is that a godly thing? And again, spoiler alert, yes, like boundaries are a good thing. But I think sometimes scripture has been used to be twisted to where we are told to deny ourselves, not to have emotions, to suppress how we're feeling.
yeah.
What would you say about that in terms of really what the truth of the Bible, what God says, what the word says in regards to our own wants, needs, and desires?
Yeah, I think we want to hold our wants, needs, and desires. We need to honor them, we need to understand them, and we need to hold them in tension before God, right? It's the harder way. The way of following Jesus is the way of not denying all of that, but it's saying, God, here's what I notice. Here's
Mhm.
what's inside of me. I also want to care about other people. I also want to be present for my children. I also want to be a good spouse. I also want to be a good friend. And I also want to be true to myself.
Mhm.
All of those things can be true. And so I think the way forward, when Jesus talks about deny yourself, I think that gets misconstrued, as you said, and I unpack this in the book to say deny. He's not saying deny your God given self, the best of you made to shine God's light through who you are. He's saying deny your selfishness. He's saying deny your old ways. And if you unpack that passage, it's all about deny the old ways. And I think of that as a therapist, as oftentimes those old ways are the ways we've learned to survive,
Mhm.
the ways we've learned to survive by pleasing other people versus in many ways being more assertive, being more honest. We we don't know sometimes what that really means. What is God calling me to deny? And sometimes, as I've, like you, I love that you studied that through the Gospels, as I've really prayed about that, it's kind of like, Allison, it's time for you to set aside that desire for everyone to like you. I
Mhm.
actually might want you to step in here with some asserting some things that you believe, some things that you need. It can look very different from how
Mhm.
I think we've assimilated those messages. As I always say, it's not about being a doormat. We
Yeah.
don't see that model in Jesus
Mhm.
at all.
Mhm. There's a fun verse in Proverbs too, and in the Message translation, it says, "Don't be a doormat." But I think for a lot of us, we feel like we shouldn't acknowledge our needs. That
Yeah.
makes us weak, and we should be stronger and basically pull ourselves up by the bootstraps and keep going and press forward. What would you say to that person who struggles with identifying what they're needing, and it can feel selfish to indulge, quote, indulge in what they want?
Yeah, I mean, I think I would look at that and get curious
Yeah.
about that, right? I always look at the posture of curiosity. Isn't that interesting that it's hard for me? I feel selfish to say I need something. Where's that from? Where did I pick up some message? Was it in my childhood? Did somebody hurt me? A lot of times we've spoken up and maybe gotten pushed down, and so we've learned, ooh, it's not safe to
Mhm.
to speak up for what I need or what I want, and just to get curious about that. Inside of yourself, do I feel a lot of guilt? Is another big one for women, right?
Oh,
Just
yeah.
tons of guilt. And sometimes I say, what did, I'll just ask a simple question: what did you do wrong? It's like there's just this
Yeah.
layers of guilt. And it's like, if you can't say specifically, I did XYZ wrong, well, it may not be coming from the Holy Spirit. Guilt it's a feeling, it's an emotion. Sometimes it tells us we did something wrong, but sometimes it's just a residual effect of our past wounds, of past messages. So really getting curious, right, about what keeps us, because we can also slip into this mentality of a little bit of a sort of a martyr mentality or a
Yeah,
victim
definitely.
mentality, right? I just never, nothing ever goes my way, or I just never, and that's not healthy for our relationships either. Our kids don't need that from us, our, our friends don't need that from us. So really getting curious and then remembering, listen, this is tiny steps
Right.
often practicing. And I really talk about that in the book. Like I remember I had to learn little tiny things, like with a new friend, instead of always doing what they want to do, just practicing, hey, what would you think about doing this?
Hmm.
Right? And that's a tiny step. Oh, was that hard for me at first
I know,
when
right?
I was learning, right? Like, what could we go to this movie? And you know what? If they're, you find out about people really fast. If they say, "Oh, I'd love that. I didn't know you liked that kind of thing. I
Hmm.
would love to join you in what you like." Wow. Or if they don't care or they make fun of you, well, good to know. That doesn't
Yeah.
seem like a really good friend to have around, right? So it's practicing small steps of, or inserting a belief, I'm not sure I agree with you on that,
Hmm.
and just taking that deep breath. That's a small step of just being a little more true, a little more authentic, and you find out really quickly what will happen in that relationship.
It's definitely a risk to be
It
vulnerable
is.
like that. And so sometimes with my clients and even with myself, I'll say, if you're not ready for that step, even just imagine if I were to take that step, what would it
Yeah,
look like?
that's good.
Give yourself permission to kind of imagine something different. And one day I'll be able to do that. But right now I'm not there yet. And I'm practicing that. And that for me has been like a big kind of helping me to have a little bit of balance as I'm doing new things. Is like I haven't learned that yet. And
Hmm.
that's okay.
That's good. I agree. I like that. I like, just give yourself permission to imagine. What
Hmm.
if? What
Hmm.
if I could?
Yeah. So what the best of you implies that there is a best of us.
Mhm.
But I feel like sometimes people feel like there's an assembly line and everyone else that has gone through that assembly line is
Mhm.
good, but somehow like God turned his back on me. And so
Mhm.
I've gone through the line, but there's really not anything good in me. Or I
Mm.
really don't have gifts and talents. Other people have them, but the things I'm good at aren't really that good, or I'm really not that worthy. What would you say to that person who's
Mhm.
struggling with the idea that even is a best of them?
Oh yeah, I hear you. I would say, again, I always start with the posture of curiosity. I wonder where you picked up that message. When did you start to believe that about yourself? Who taught you that as a young child, right? Because so much of this goes back to the wounds of our childhood, whether the wounds we picked up at school, in our families, where we just started to believe these lies about ourselves. And it's not our fault, there's no shame. But
Exactly.
again, I would start to get curious about, when did you start to believe that? Where did you learn that? Let's just start there. We don't have to rush to the best of you, let's start. And in the book, I do that. I go back to, where did that maybe come from?
Mhm.
And is there any compassion for that younger version of you that somewhere along the line started to believe, I'm not good enough, I don't have what it takes, I'm not worthwhile, and kind of started giving up, right, on your own self? Let's just kind of look back at some of those moments and see if we can begin to heal just a few of those moments,
Mhm.
right? And a lot of times people will have memories. It's fascinating. I'm sure you find this. Do you remember? And they'll be like, this random memory. They feel it'll be random. And I tell a
Right.
story in the book about one of my own that's really random. It's like a sixth grade play, right? Where I kind of fumbled the ball, but I picked up a wound. I'm not good enough. I'm not as good as other people. I should always stay hidden. And, people have these sort of seemingly random memories, but they connect to a moment in time where they really bought into, especially when they're young, this, I bet I don't matter. Why bother? And we have to heal that, and we have to try to go back to that younger version, and unburden and create a new narrative there,
Mhm.
that little bit by bit by bit.
I love that. And I'm also imagining too, whenever, if we want to practice the best of ourselves, I think to not pay attention and to be mindful of our past self is almost just like trying to cover up and be better, to white knuckle it.
Yes.
And when we have that curiosity and compassion with ourselves, I think it just helps us to honor our childlike self
Yeah,
and to see the beauty. I don't think there's very many of us that can look at a kid and be like, ooh, that kid's like terrible. Usually
exactly.
when we see a child, we see their innocence, their cuteness, like the goodness in them. And
Yeah.
all of us have that.
That's right. And that's, I think, what Jesus, when he talks about let the little children come to me, there's something about the purity of a
Mhm.
child. Sure, kids can be, they act out, and but that's also part of their beauty is they're very authentic. They're
I
very
know,
much who,
right?
who they are. And that's when we get kind of clobbered, right? That's when we get wounded, is when we're being, someone says that's bad, you shouldn't do that. And even the best of parents, again, it's not about being perfect, but it is trying to thread that needle of helping your child and our own inner children to see the beauty in
Mm-hmm.
who they are, even as we also learn how to lead ourselves.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, totally. And I do feel compelled to say, like, every one of us is good. The
Yeah,
Bible is true for everybody. It's
yeah,
not just true for these people or those people.
that's right.
I believe that God is a God of equality, and Ephesians 2:10 is for all of us. Like, we're
Yeah,
all God's masterpiece. And so I was wondering if
yeah.
you could speak into that and say more about that.
I agree. Genesis 1:27, I think, where it says we every human soul is made in the image of God. And that's it. Every human soul. You walk down the street and just really let that sink in for a minute. Every human soul, no matter how, you know, far away you may feel like your life has gone, your soul is made in the image of God. That's just a fact. And some of us have had more wounds and more hard times. And so we feel like we've gotten really far away from that. But it doesn't change the DNA, the essence of who we are, right? And God is, I believe, constantly in the process of trying to heal. The Greek word sozo that is often used saved is also translated heal. God is trying to heal us. He's constantly
Mhm.
trying to bring his healing work into the world and heal
Mhm.
every human soul and draw every human soul into more and more of the person he wants us to be. We have some free will in that, sure, of course.
Mhm.
But I absolutely agree with you that we have to start there. We have to start with this idea of no matter how far away I feel, God,
Mhm.
you put something good in me. Help me move toward that. Help me take one tiny step toward that direction.
Mhm. Yeah, it is a faith walk
Yes.
to say that there's something
Yes.
good in me, because that can feel so risky. And so what would you say to
Yes.
the person who's struggling? Like, I want to believe there's something good in me, but because of my trauma, because of lies that
Yeah.
have been spoken over me, I just don't know. And I keep messing up, and maybe
Mhm.
there's really not the best of me. What are some ways for us to practice that process?
One of the things I do is try to walk people through a list of questions along the lines of what has brought out the best of you. And so you're asking a great question, when have you caught a glimpse? I use that word glimpse a lot of a part of you that you were like, wow, that was kind of cool. Or who do you feel like the best version of yourself with? Who's someone who brings out the best of you? Start to pay attention.
Mhm.
When you're out in nature, when you're paddle boating, when you're, skiing with your kids, when do you feel alive? When do you feel like, oh, everybody's got a moment or two like that. And you're catching a glimpse, I believe, in those moments of that God breathed self. And so you can start to notice, I talk a lot in the book about shame, and I rely on Kurt Thompson's work that shame is the enemy's way of kind of pulling us away from the best of who we are, right? But the antidote to that, it's we got to pay attention to that voice because that's the voice of shame, and that's not what we want to listen to. The antidote to that is the voice of these glimpses of, wait a minute, there's something good there. Follow those voices, follow those glimpses. because that's the voice of God kind of beckoning you to return to your truest God-made self.
I love that so much. I think that's a good reminder for us. Shame tells us that we are bad. That's an
Yep.
identity statement.
Yep.
God says that we're called, we're chosen, we're worthy, we're
Yes.
redeemed. And
That's
he
right.
calls us into life versus shame calls us into death and bondage.
Exactly. That's exactly right. It's just, but we can listen to the voice of shame if we're not careful.
Oh, it can sound very compelling because it
Very
very good because we're not perfect. Like we fall short, we
exactly.
mess up.
Yes. And
Mhm.
so it's such a process of learning to go, wait, I think that's the voice of shame. And then even sometimes saying, even if I did mess up, right? The shame isn't helped. The shame doesn't help that. It's like I can own that I'm imperfect, or that this moment wasn't my best moment. And also, I don't I can I can learn to get a little distance from the shame and go, and also every single day I'm moving a little bit more honestly, more openly. And to me, that's freedom, right? When I can take my soul before God and say, man, God, here I am. Here's the broken corners.
Yeah.
Here's the here's the parts where, oh man, I'm still a work in progress. And there's no shame, but there's that openness with God. That there's joy and freedom in that, right? It's not kind of the opposite of shame isn't like toxic positivity, right? Like I'm
Right.
great. It's honest transparency with the God who loves us and made us and sees the best of who we are. And also is like, yeah, you're not quite there yet, but that's okay.
But he
You're right
doesn't
where
put
you
a
need to be.
condemnation, right? It's
No
not a
condemnation.
condemnation, but it's just more like you're saying, like remove the layers that aren't you.
That's right.
And that's so freeing. One of the
Yes.
exercises you have in the book that I really liked was you tell us to write down a list of 10 things of what we want. And I, as a counselor, I can't help but, pay attention with mindfulness. And like that made me feel
Yeah.
both excited and also a little scared and like guilty feeling. So talk to us
Yeah.
about the benefit and value and beauty of identifying what we want, and even the challenges that can pop up with saying this is what I want.
Yes. Yeah, and I think I even say in that section, you're going to notice a bunch of different thoughts and feelings surrounding this because we don't know what we want. But that's why I say the exercise, just write it all down. And not in this way of I'm going after these things, but just beginning this process of noticing, of paying attention with God, inviting God. What I would say is invite God into that process. Because as you make that list and parts of you are like, oh, that's selfish, or I feel guilty for that, or what if I can't get that, or what does that say about me, or oh, I really want this and this is painful to admit. I mean, there's so many emotions, right, with desire. But as we notice that, and every day we come before God, we refine that list. We refine, is that selfish? And I remember when I did this myself, and there was something, and I really wanted it, and I just felt like it was so selfish. And actually, as I prayed through it, I was like, I don't think it is selfish. I actually think God is nudging me
Mm,
toward that, right? We're sometimes surprised. And then there might be things we really, really, really think we want, and God, and our fists are kind of clenched like this, and God might pry those hands open and say, that's one we're going to sit with for a while, you
yeah.
for whatever reason, right? But it's learning again that self-awareness, when we bring it with God awareness, leads us to that truer, what do I really
Mm,
want? Because sure, are there superficial things I think I want that at the end of the day, over as I really work through it with God, God's like, I guess I didn't want that so much. It's changed. I've gotten more to the root of what the deeper thing is, right? That's the process of self-awareness, being more and more aware of ourselves. But if I never name that thing that I feel like is selfish, if I don't name it and talk to God about it, it's just going to fester there. It's not going to go away. So I might as
yeah.
well bring it out into the light and say, hey, God, here it is. I don't know. I don't know if it's bad, good, or selfish, but it's real.
Mhm,
Help me understand. And then you find a couple of safe people,
mhm,
right? This is the process of
yeah.
becoming a whole person.
That's so good. And what I'm hearing you say in that self-awareness is how trust factors into that. And I feel like
Yeah.
the more self-aware we become, the more we trust ourselves. This is something as a counselor, I'm always super fascinated by. in regards to what does it really mean to trust yourself and helping clients to walk that road of trust. I'm
Yes.
curious what your thoughts are in regards to number one, is it even okay to trust yourself? And
Yeah.
it is. So I'm going to the second question, but I want to hear it from you. And then what are some ways that we can begin building and practicing trust with ourselves? Because it can just, again, feel very scary.
Yes. And you're exactly right. That was the perfect segue, because this is where we fear trusting ourselves, because we, like we look at these desires, we're like, I'm not sure, but that's why we have to cultivate this practice of self-awareness, so that we can trust ourselves, so that we can really go, when I really get to the bottom of it, I've thought about it, I've prayed about it, I've examined it, I've laid it all out before God.
Mm-hmm.
I can trust this. I can move in this direction. And we God has given us, he has designed our bodies, our minds, our souls, our emotions to be resources to us.
Mm-hmm.
And I talk a lot in the book about how we're so conditioned to look externally. You just tell me what I want. You just tell me what I need. But God has given us so much internally to cue us. Our bodies might just be we're like, I just dread doing that thing one more time. Well, let's pay attention to that, because your body's telling you something. Now, if it's something you have to do, then you figure that out. You figure out, but maybe your body is giving you a cue that you can trust, that I've got to change how I relate to this situation, because it is filling me with angst. And
Mm-hmm.
I've either got to get out of this relationship, or have a conversation in this relationship, or, whatever, because it is something inside of me is saying, this just is not bringing me life. And we begin to, it starts with paying attention. You can't know what you aren't paying attention to. And it doesn't mean, secondly, it doesn't mean the minute I notice, ooh, that felt bad, I just throw the thing out,
Mm-hmm.
you know, right? Like a marriage or a friendship, necessarily, right? Because we have to, it's the start is paying attention, and then going to God. This is all about discernment.
Mm-hmm.
What, what is going on here? What is going on here that my body is, I get so anxious, or emotionally I'm so devastated by this. We start to pay attention, and we learn about ourselves. We get curious about ourselves, and then we're going to get the wisdom to actually know what to apply in that situation. So
Mm-hmm.
trusting yourself is not just, well, I'm at the whim of my emotions, I don't like it, so I don't do it. It's a deeper journey of bringing our whole self into partnership with God.
Mm-hmm. It makes me think about a tree. A tree
Yeah,
can be very sturdy, but not whenever it's first planted and it's a little sapling. But
good.
the more that you water it, the more that it grows, the more sturdy it becomes. And I think as we're on our own journey and process, to know that we might be a little shaky at first, but don't be afraid to do the work.
Yes, and that those roots, I love that metaphor. It reminds me of Psalm 1 as well. And that as we do that work, as we get to the root of what we're really thinking, feeling, we're developing our roots, which develops that sturdier over
Mhm.
time. We start to more quickly go, that's not safe for me. I'm
Yeah.
going to move the other direction, instead of getting ensnared by it. We
Hmm.
more quickly, really, we've fine-tuned. You think about athletes who work out their bodies so their bodies know what to do when the ball comes their way, right? It's the same with our spiritual and psychological lives. The more we've worked ourselves,
Hmm.
the more we've paid attention to our instrument, the more we know what to do when life throws us its landmines.
Hmm. Hmm. And again, that can feel very scary. You write about the importance of, in order to be our best self, we need to be willing to go deep and
Mm-hmm.
to feel our pain. And I think as a Christian, again, I think that can be very confusing because there's been a
Mm-hmm.
lot of scriptures that have been distorted and twisted and used against us. And so, what would you say to the person of why they need to feel their pain and even the beauty of feeling
Mm-hmm.
that emotional pain?
Yeah, I mean, the first thing I would say to that is, we see a full range of emotions in Jesus. We see anger, we see grief, we see anguish. He was not an emotionless human when he was on earth. And so, if And he didn't sin. So if Jesus demonstrated that full range of emotions, why wouldn't we, right? So that's the first thing. The second thing is emotions. We don't have to act out of every emotion, but we
Mhm.
do need to honor the different emotions because they're just cues. They're cues about something. Anger is a cue that maybe we've been hurt.
Mhm.
We need to pay attention to that because anger, if we feel it and we notice it and we pay attention to it, can help us set healthier boundaries with other people when we need to. That's
Mhm.
what Jesus did. He got angry and he spoke up about things.
You really did,
Grief,
yeah.
grief is a natural process that our bodies need to go through when we've suffered pain. And those things are part of a full the best of you life. They're part of, I talk about at the end of the book, what does it mean to
Mhm.
become the best of you? It means experiencing a full range of emotions. And I love your analogy of the tree, but those emotions no longer take us over. We experience
Mhm.
them even as simultaneously we can be kind to ourselves through
Mhm.
the process. We no longer fear our emotions. We can
Mhm.
have this idea of, okay, there's the anger. Oh boy, okay, I know what to do. I know how to ground myself. I know how to pay attention instead of being at the whim of our emotions. We lead our emotions versus our emotions kind of taking us over.
I love that. And even when you think about the best of you, it makes you think about like daisies and sunshine and rainbows. And that's not what you're saying. Really, in the
Mm-mm.
best of you
No.
is embracing life's hardships and being
Yes.
honest about them and
Yes.
allowing some good and transformation to happen. And so I think again, it's not about just being happy all the time. Like we're not at
No.
Disneyland. Like life
No.
is really hard, but
It's
if
hard.
we're not able to embrace it and learn from it, we become just so detached and disconnected from ourselves.
That's right. And God doesn't promise us, like you said, Disneyland lives. But when I think of the fruit of the Spirit, which is what God does promise us, one of the things I talk a lot about with people is what would it be like to learn how to show kindness? We have to think about showing those to other people, but what would it be if you could be really kind to yourself? What
Mhm.
would it be if you could learn how to be really patient with yourself, to be really faithful to yourself, to be really gentle with yourself? And I think that's getting closer to what I mean by the best of you. It's
Totally.
learning, right, how to apply all of those the fruitfulness of that life internally, where we're really living, not putting on those fruit externally, but living out of them because we've actually glimpsed a little bit of those qualities inside of ourselves.
We've birthed those gifts versus hot
Yes.
gluing on
Yes. Yes,
the fruit.
exactly. I love that.
Another fascinating concept that you talk about in the book is codependency.
Yeah.
And so I would love to end with this question. How does codependency keep us from being our best self?
Well, I think codependency is basically this catch-all phrase right now that's so popular, and I think it's very common where we bypass ourselves in the name of essentially being completely focused on someone else. And instead of bringing our whole self into a relationship. And that's basically how I talk about it in the book is all of what we're describing when we bypass the self, bypass our emotions, when we, bypass our own pain, we're setting ourselves up for codependency because we've kind of set ourselves aside, which means we're just going to only I'm going to focus on you. I'm going to build my world around you, but I'm not bringing myself into that relationship with you. And so it's not a healthy, it can't thrive. We put ourselves at the mercy of other people instead of developing into the person God wants us to be. So I think codependency is really kind of the big umbrella term of what happens when we don't do this work of becoming a self, of becoming our true selves.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, my worth then becomes dependent on what you're doing,
That's right.
who I am. And so it's almost
That's
like
right.
that seesaw where
It's
just trying so hard and most of us don't even realize that's what we're doing.
it's not a fun way to live where you're just living for the validation of the people around you. You're dependent on their validation as opposed to internally having that sort of navigation system internally that tells you who you are, whose you are, where you need to go. And again, you're bringing that into your relationships, but ultimately, You know who you are. You're not at the whim of other people.
Hmm. Yeah, and that's so important.
Yep.
Um, what would you say, Dr. Cook, just for the person who again is struggling, because I just feel like somebody's like struggling with this. What would you
Yeah.
say about who they are as a person and how there is a best of them and a simple path out of
Mm.
the teeter-totter or through their healing process in terms of this is who I am and I believe that God has created me for a purpose and I'm going to begin living out of that truth and
Mhm.
walking away from the lie that the worst of me is me.
Yeah, I think you just nailed it in that last sentence. I think it starts perhaps for some people who are listening that just feel that shame has taken over so much. Sometimes I will say to clients, can you just, if you can't believe that that's not the true story, can you get a paper's width of distance? Just start there. Is it possible that that's not the truth? Just
Mm,
entertain the possibility. If you can't fully buy into what I'm saying, is it possible that that lie, that shaming message that it's too late for you, or you're too far gone, or it's you're not worthy. Is it possible? Could you even entertain a paper width of possibility that that's a lie? And what if it's not? And what do you notice inside of you at the thought of imagining that? Maybe it feels overwhelming. Maybe it feels too good to be true. Just notice that and just ask God. Just ask God. God, I've got a paper's width of faith, right? I've got a fingertip of faith that maybe it's not too late for me. That maybe I can begin to move toward healing. That's one step of faith. A mustard seed is all it takes, really, right? And then each day, what's that next step? Pace yourself, right? This doesn't happen overnight.
hmm. Yeah, it is a journey and
It's a
that
journey.
process of just being willing to practice something new.
Yeah.
I can like guarantee, I can't guarantee very many things, but I can
Mhm.
guarantee you that every one of us has an identity and calling. I mean, it's like the work that we do, right, as clinician.
Yep.
That's why it's on my website, Ephesians 2:10. We are God's
Yeah.
masterpiece, made new in Christ Jesus, to do the
That's
good
right.
things that He's prepared in advance for us to do. All of us have a purpose, all of us have a calling.
That's right. And you and I know this, but we wouldn't do this work if we didn't believe it and if we hadn't seen it. If we
Right.
hadn't seen people's lives changed. And I see it all the time. And you know what? I mean, I've worked with lots of folks who, man, they've made their lives have just gone off the rails for so many reasons, for whatever reason. It's not too late. And it is amazing to see these lives rebuilt. It's work. Sometimes you imagine it like building a house, brick by brick by brick. But if you don't start with that first brick, with that very, very, very first step, what if it could be different?
Mm-hmm.
What if my life really does matter to God?
Mm-hmm.
What if this next minute really does matter?
Mm-hmm.
How would your life be different if you
Mm-hmm.
started to live that way?
That's good. I think for me too in my life, I think I found joy in laying the brick.
Mm,
And we can feel like that's laborious, but the work that God gives us to do is a good work. It
I
brings
agree.
joy to our soul. And the more I learn about my own mental health and what I need, these are all
Mhm.
things I like doing.
Yeah.
Going out in nature, walking, getting
Yes.
sleep, drinking water. I mean,
Yeah.
there's a lot of like basic things that I actually like doing. It's not a sacrifice. The other
That's right.
way is actually harder, even though it feels easier in the moment.
I love those examples you just gave. Those are such good, concrete examples of taking a small step toward I really do matter. And guess what that means? I should feed myself some water today.
Yeah.
It's like a plant, taking
Mhm.
care of a plant.
Mhm.
It's like that is a step toward life, and you're right.
Mhm.
That is a building block each day. I do, and I talk about that. I'm like, what is something, a tiny step you can take and just commit to it for 2 weeks?
Yeah.
That's for you. And it might be having a glass of water every day. It might be getting up and taking a walk every day just to say, I want to at least change one thing. And that's a good thing for me.
Mhm.
That is a win. That is a beautiful win. And like you said, it's one step, but it's in and of itself becomes a building block and a really beautiful thing in your life that you've done.
So good. So good. Where can we find you and where can we get the book?
DrAlisonCook.com. It's Allison with one L, is my website. I have a bunch of pre-order incentives, Boundaries for Women course, 5 toxic behaviors and how to protect yourself webinar series, a bunch of stuff on calming emotions. So I have a bunch of free resources right now that I'm giving to people when they pre-order the book. So you can pre-order the book anywhere books are sold, but then go to my website, which again is dralisoncook.com/book for all of those freebies.
So good. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you.